Right then, back in March, I reviewed MSI's beastly Ti5 pre-built gaming PC, and after I posted the video, MSI said I could keep it, which was huge for me because my personal gaming PC was like super outdated to the point where I couldn't make any more gaming monitor reviews because my PC at the time couldn't output enough FPS to match the monitor's refresh. The only problem is, even though I think the wild case design looks really cool, it just doesn't line up with my personal style or desk setup for that matter. So what I wanted to do is harvest as much as I could from the Ti5, swap it over to a small form factor case, and add a few small upgrades. Sounds easy enough, right? Yeah, well, finding a mini ITX case that somehow supports mATX size motherboards, which is what the Ti5 comes with, is a lot harder than it sounds, especially if you're not looking to pay upwards of like $400 plus international shipping costs from a low batch limited release manufacturer, you know? But I did find this guy. This is the SAMA IM01, and it only cost me like 80 or 90 Canadian. It has a bunch of other names too, but this is the North American version, which honestly looks the best because most of the other brand names it's under have some sort of logo screen printed on the front panel. It is very similar looking to Cooler Master's mini ITX case, the NR200. I mean, it's not as clean and elegant looking, but you should still consider this case a large mini ITX case first and foremost, and an mATX case second. Like at 22 liters of space, you'll have an infinitely easier time building in this case with an ITX motherboard and SFX power supply, but it still has tremendous support for mATX motherboards and even ATX power supplies. And it's actually kind of a unicorn case because there's so many different configuration options it'll make your head spin. So I'm gonna have a link in the description that'll show you just some of the different config setups you can use with this case, but for me, I'm gonna be doing a sort of hybrid build with this one. So there's mesh venting on the top, bottom, and both side panels with magnetic dust filters, which I won't be using. It has both 2-slot vertical and 4-slot horizontal GPU mount supporting up to 335mm GPUs, supports up to 240mm side-mounted AIOs or a gigantic air cooler. For the front panel top-mounted I/O, we've got 2 USB 3.0 ports as well as separate mic and headphones ports. It has 3 3.5-inch hard drive locations and 3 SSD locations. There's technically 6 fan mount locations just littered throughout the case, but that really depends on your build configuration, and it can even be flipped upside down for top radiator mounting by removing the front panel I/O and riser feet and simply just swapping their orientation, although you'd have to tap new holes for the riser feet. And like I mentioned earlier, there's support for both ATX and SFX power supplies using one of the 2 mounting brackets included with this case. With an ITX motherboard and using the cage mounting bracket, which also doubles as the hard drive and or SSD caddy by the way, you can have it either beside the motherboard or mounted on the front panel facing side of the chassis. Now, I'm gonna be using the SFX power supply that came with the Ti5, so considering I'm using the mATX motherboard and AIO cooler also from the Ti5, I wanted to see if I could get the power supply as close to the motherboard tray as possible to make more room for the radiator that's being side mounted. So, I dicked around with drilling holes into the ATX bracket and then screwing an SFX to ATX adapter plate to the bracket and then mounting the SFX PSU to that. Sounds complicated, right? I know. And that's why the bracket's all fucked up in case you were wondering. Anyways, it works, but I'd need to do a bit more modding to the adapter plate for everything to fit completely flush, and quite frankly, that's more effort than I'm willing to invest at this moment. Luckily, I found a much easier and cleaner workaround, which I'll get to during the build portion of the video, so stick around for that. But first, I need to harvest those parts from the Ti5. That being said, I'm gonna save you the agony of watching me un-Tetris this insane maze of a case, and instead go over the parts that I picked from it, which includes an MSI Z490 motherboard with an Intel Core i9-10900K. The motherboard is pretty bare bones, so heavy overclocking likely won't be possible, but it has 2 2280 M.2 slots on the front and 1 on the back, as well as a half-size slot for the wireless card with the antenna wires hanging off, which I'll hide in the new case somewhere. It supports overclocking, and it's been working just fine so far. I also pulled out the MSI MAG Core Liquid 240R AIO, the MSI Ventus 3X RTX 3080, and the MSI MPG A750GF SFX power supply. But I'm gonna be swapping the stock RAM from the 32 gigs of generic looking Samsung RAM running at 3000 MHz to 32 gigs of G-Skills Trident Z running at 3200. I'll also be adding 2 Arctic Bionics P12 ARGB fans for the AIO and 4 Noctua NFP12 Redux fans for the case, which I'll be connecting to a cheap 1 to 5 4-pin fan splitter. So in theory, that should keep everything nice and cool. Hopefully. So, like any small form factor case, the build has had its challenges. First off, because I'm using an mATX board, and I want to have a couple of intake fans at the bottom, I have to give up the front panel I/O because the fans are blocking the pins and connectors. Now, I never use front panel audio, so that's fine, but I do use the USB ports from time to time. Luckily, I've got a USB hub mounted underneath my desk next to the edge, so it's easy for me to reach, but if I was working with an ITX board, this wouldn't have even been an issue. Now, next challenge was side mounting that 240mm radiator with the SFX power supply cage in the way, because it's not technically supposed to fit a side-mounted radiator with an mATX board and the SFX PSU in that location, but it is possible. With a catch. The radiator itself cannot be over 275mm in length exactly. The radiator I'm using is 274mm, and it's a super tight fit. Now, I did have to take a Dremel and grind out a bit more length in those screw slots on the mounting bracket, but after that, it's just a matter of mounting the fans and radiator to the bracket from the inside, because with everything mounted to each other, it's too thick to just drop in. This was fairly tricky to do, but not impossible. You just need a little patience. Now, once the GPU was in, cable management became another challenge, but honestly, it wasn't too bad because there is a bit of space underneath the PSU and a tiny bit more on the opposite side between the motherboard tray and the PSU cage. And so with the build almost finished, here's what the inside looks like with the radiator all buttoned up. It's tight, but there's still space for airflow. And here's the final build. Now, considering there's no glass panels, I didn't need or want to go all in on RGB. So even though the RAM has RGB, I already had 2 sticks from the previous build, so it just made sense to buy another 2 of the same. I did want the radiator fans to have RGB though, so I could just see 2 simple glowing circles through the perforated holes on the side panel, which I thought would look cool. Unfortunately, because I had to shift the radiator over so much to fit in there, the fan's lighting on the left is cut off a bit. I still think it looks good, but I might change my mind down the road and swap out for some more Noctua fans. Anyways, as you can see, it takes up way less room on my desk than the TI-5 did, and now it actually fits in with my more minimalistic looking desk setup style. And the best part is, it's got a decent boost in performance with its newfound optimized cooling setup. Okay, so get this, when it was the TI-5 running ATIS-64's system stability test, the CPU averaged 81 degrees Celsius at 4.9 gigahertz all-core boost clock. Now it averages about 66 degrees, which means we've got a bit more overclocking headroom, but not as much as you'd think. Turns out 5.2 gigahertz is all this bare-bones Z490 motherboard can handle, at least in Cinebench R23. At 5.3 gigahertz, it just crashes as soon as it hits start on the stability test. At 5.2 gigahertz though, it'll maintain clock speeds for about 5 minutes or less until the temps spike into the high 90s and then it thermal throttles, but it doesn't crash after running for the full 30 minutes. Plus, it scored 1,600 points higher in the multi-core test than it did with the TI-5. And I can run it at that 5.2 gigahertz in ATIS-64 all day long with temps averaging only 75 degrees, so personally, I'd call this overclock safe and stable enough for gaming. Now, while idle, it may not be dead silent, but it's quiet enough at 39 dB, which is about 6 dB over ambient. And that's actually pretty fair considering there's 3 more fans than before for a total of 6. Under load, it's loud as hell though, but I mean, I either have my soundbar cranked or I'm wearing headphones when gaming, so that doesn't bother me. The GPU is also loving life with those 2 intake fans at the bottom of the case sitting about an inch from its fans, resulting in an average of only 54 degrees while gaming compared to the mid to high 70s running the same games when it was the TI-5 just before tearing it apart. And because GPU temps are lower too, I overclocked it. Nothing crazy by any means, but the 54 degrees it's hitting now is with that overclock. And so of course gaming performance has improved a little bit too, averaging 130 FPS on low settings in Battlefield 2042. Look, it's the best I could get. That game's an unoptimized mess right now, so I don't really play it that often anymore. I have been playing Chivalry 2 quite a bit recently though, which has been averaging 130 FPS on Epic, so I'm pretty happy with that. All in all, I'm actually really pleased with how everything turned out. It looks way better on my desk now, it runs cooler, and it now performs a little better. But I do have future plans for this though. For example, I'd like to eventually switch over to an ITX motherboard, which by then will likely support PCIe Gen 5 or something more if I don't upgrade before then, because at the moment the current motherboard only supports Gen 3, so I am missing out a bit on some performance gains and other benefits. But anyways, I think that's gonna do it for this one. I hope you found this video at least a little interesting, but even if you didn't, thanks as always for watching, and I'll talk to you all in the next one. Cheers.